one term, and we're glad to see a nice turnout for our speaker today, who is Eliza Dresang, who is the Beverly Cleary Chair in Children's Services at the University of Washington. The Beverly Cleary Chair is a very special position in library information science. It's the first and one of very few endowed chairs. It's specifically focused on children and youth. And so it's a very important position in terms of both research and advocacy for children's services and children's literature. And we're very pleased that Eliza could be that Beverly Cleary Chair. I was excited when she was appointed to that position. We're very excited to bring her up here to talk about her most recent IMLS-funded research grant, which is Project Views, which is talking about early literacy assessment and the role of assessing early literacy programs in public libraries. Eliza has had a long and distinguished career as both an educator and a researcher and scholar at several institutions, including the University of Wisconsin, Florida State, and most recently at the University of Washington. So, without further ado, please a warm welcome for Eliza Dresang.
Thank you, Eric. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for coming out to share this with me. I started out with the little picture up in the corner is Beverly Cleary. Part of the enticement for getting me to come to Washington was a trip to visit her in Northern California, where she lives. And she's now 94, and she isn't writing anymore, but she's just as sharp as can be, and Ramona personified. So I thought I'd just start out with a statement of what my overarching research area is. And this is the statement that I make when I try to describe it in the elevator. Formal and informal information behavior and resources for digital age youth, meaning birth to 21, and the adults who work with them. Nice narrow topic, right? So I've just put some representations of some of the recent research that I've done, although I'm focusing on one project today. Last year, actually, I was invited up by Judy Saltman and her students to talk about radical change. This is down in the corner of the screen over here. Radical Change Books for Youth in a Digital Age is the name of a book that I wrote about a decade ago now. And it incorporates a theory of explanation why books for youth have changed in the digital age. Meanwhile, since then, a number of people have actually started applying radical change to information behavior, and I have actually have a doctoral student right now who is developing indicators for the information behavior use of that theory as her dissertation research. So that's going to expand the use of that theory. But I do a fair amount of work with children and young adult literature, and over in the corner here, and actually I brought some handouts, but I think I left them up in the office, so I'll leave them with Eric, and he can put in a public place that you all can pick them up, because this is a brand new book, Children's and Young Adult Literature. It's called The Handbook of Research in Children's and Young Adult Literature, and it's an interdisciplinary effort between LIS, education, and English. And it has three components. It focuses on the reader first, and then the book, and then the context. And so it's quite encyclopedic, but I think a pretty exciting volume. So I would recommend that you look for that. And the little cat in the middle is a Scratch cat. How many of you are familiar with Scratch? Is anybody? I just talked about it to some students this morning, so I know they are. It's a programming language for, well, it's developed for kids 9 to 13, but they have a graph on their website that shows that people of all ages actually use it, but that's where the concentration is. And it was developed in the lifelong kindergarten part of the MIT Media Lab, and it an object programming language, so you drag objects together to make programs, do what you want them to, talk, walk, dance, sing. And it started in 2007, and it now has over 1 million projects are posted online, and over 500,000, mostly kids, are in it. So my student that's doing this dissertation is using Scratch Kids as for her data, testing of her data. And I'm currently, almost a decade ago, it's hard to believe that, I wrote an article that was for this volume, The Ivory Tower in Harry Potter, and I'm in the process of writing another article analyzing repetition in Harry Potter books. And up in the top, where I have all those kids standing together, I have a proposal in to the Paul Allen Family Foundation to develop some apps for mobile phones that will hopefully get kids connected better to libraries. And then in the other up-hand corner, I've just finished a project with 30 teachers that were actually supported by another IMLS grant I had in Florida to become librarians and to also pledge to take the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And I followed them through part of that process. So those are just some of the things that I've been doing. But this is what I'm talking about today. Project Views, valuable initiatives in early learning that work successfully is what we got out of that. And then I added, or do they? So I have been interested in evaluation in a lot of my research, and I actually did a project in the St. Louis Public Library some years ago, 2001 to 2003, also MLS supported. And it was looking at kids' use of technology in, again, the kind of 9 to 13 age group. And out of it came a model for outcome-based planning and evaluation, which I and my two partners published in this book. So Project Views is something that started almost 2 years ago now, and what I'm going to do today is first tell you a little bit of the story of how this research got started, because I think that's always interesting. Where did it come from, and why, of all the things that there are to find out, why am I working on this particular project right at the moment? So it all started with the once upon a time of my being recruited, as Eric mentioned, to the Cleary Professorship at the University of Washington Information School. And as part of the recruitment, I was asked to come out about this time 2 years ago. I started in January 2 years ago. So before I came, to visit with what's called the Cleary Libraries, these 6 libraries listed across the bottom, in addition to the majority of the endowment, which was contributed by Mrs. Cleary and her family. These 6 libraries also contributed to it, and so I have a special contractual relationship with them for 5 years. And it's been great because they're right there when I need to ask a question of somebody in practice, and it comes the other way too. I'm at the university, and so we have a really good exchange. So I went and visited with the youth services people at these 6 libraries before I actually started the job. And one of the ideas of the Cleary Professorship is to have a really special and close communication with the library community. And so I said, you know, I'll probably be starting a new research agenda. I had to sadly leave a grant behind at Florida State, and I said, what would interest you? What would you like to see the information school working on in the area of children and youth services? So much to my surprise, that all 6 groups independently meeting, they all said early literacy, early learning. That is what's on their minds in terms of what they're investing a lot in and what they're interested in. So that was the first step in Project Views. The next thing I did, because then I started talking to the coordinators, children's coordinators, and other people while I was still here on that same trip. And I said, you know, why do you think everybody is telling me this? Why are they saying this? And so one of the leaders of, among the children's, she's the library director, Neil Perry, said to me, we have had almost a decade of working with early literacy in libraries now in a very focused and purposeful way. And we have been very fortunate in getting funding from different foundations and so forth for it. For example, the Paul Allen Foundation gave about $750,000 to train librarians in Washington in the American Library Association's program, Every Child Ready to Read. But now the foundations are saying, well, we've invested, what's good has it done? How do we know the children are any better off than they were 10 years ago? How do we know? And Neil said, we don't know how to know, so that's what we want you to tell us. And so then I found out also in that talk that there are a lot of resources focused on early learning in the state of Washington. And I'm just going to tell you about some of them because some of them may exist in other places or they might be able to be replicated, and some of them I think are pretty unique. And all of them sort of go back to 1998 when there was a governor's commission when Gary Locke, who's now our Commerce Secretary, was governor of Washington. And he set up a commission which his wife and Melinda Gates and Mona Locke chaired on early literacy. So they were right at the forefront of a focus on early learning and early literacy that spread across the country. So out of that, over subsequent years, several things came. One is the Washington State Department of Early Learning that was established in 2006, and to the best of my ability to find out, it's the only cabinet-level position in the country devoted to early learning. So that makes Washington special right there. This URL I have under there leads to a brand new 10-year, what they're calling roadmap for early learning, which is completely on the web, so it's there for anyone who's interested in looking. And I think it's quite well done, actually. An exciting thing about it is that it includes libraries. It has libraries in it. So there is a reason for that, and that sort of comes through two of the other things up here. The middle thing, the Foundation for Early Learning. So that was one of the first things that came out of this study. This Foundation for Early Learning was formed. It raises money and gives away money for early learning projects throughout the state of Washington at the community level. And so along the way, historically, libraries were doing things, but they were kind of over here to the side, and then there were the other early learning community people. And so people like Neil Perry, who I mentioned before, and Judy Nelson, who's our youth coordinator, and other library leaders in Washington said, we're sick and tired of being left off the table. We want to be at the table. And they hired a facilitator to help them think of how they could better be at the table. They showed that they role modeled that they could do it. And so what came out of that meeting was something that's at the bottom down here called the Early Learning Public Library Partnership. And that started, I think it's in its third year now. And it's an agreement among and between libraries in the state of Washington, library systems that want to join it, and they pay 1/2%, I believe, of their annual budget to this Foundation for Early Learning up here in the middle to be sure that libraries are represented in any appropriate projects that come across their desk, which is almost everything that happens in the state of Washington. And so this is one reason that I believe libraries are represented in the state early learning plan, because the program officer from the Foundation for Early Learning was on the committee that formed the 10-year plan. And she had her other constituents, but libraries in her head. So the lesson of that is getting built into some kind of infrastructure, some kind of formal way to be represented. And that's what's happened in Washington. 5x5 is just hard to understand. Even the people in Washington don't understand it real well. But it is kind of explained as a private-public entity that also, kind of like the Foundation of Early Learning, funds things, but they fund very specific targeted things around the state in the area of early learning, and specifically things that the Department of Early Learning wants to see happen. So it's not exactly in the same process. And they work, so all these people work really closely together. I was amazed when I found out that all this was going on. Meanwhile, back at Florida State, where I still had one foot in the door, these two people that are in the picture with me also had an interest in early learning. Janet, who's standing to my left, is a doctoral student who will be defending, and actually the week after Thanksgiving, she'll be defending her dissertation. And I was on her committee, and Kathy Burnett, so in the picture, is her major professor. And they had independently come to me before I came out to Washington, and Janet had said, I really want to do something in the area of early learning for my dissertation. She had been working throughout her doctoral career with the Florida Reading Research Institute at FSU with Chris Lonigan, if some of you may know that name. And and Kathy, who's always very entrepreneurial, said, and it'd be nice if she could get a grant to do it. So all these ideas were in my head, and I came out here and I heard everything that was going on. And then I arrived. That's what it looked like when I arrived. It was horrible. And so I said, I moved from Florida? What is this that I've done? And so I actually was pretty much housebound for the first week I was here because I didn't have a snow shovel. I had lived in Florida 12 years. I left them all in Wisconsin. I didn't have any sand. I didn't have any snow. And the mayor, in all his wisdom, and the city council had actually decided that you couldn't use salt in the city of Seattle, even though the water with the salt was going to run into the ocean. But anyway, so we couldn't, nothing could happen with the streets. It was just impossible. Plus, I hadn't become accustomed to the hills. And maybe for that reason, I was shut in. And I started thinking more about, could we apply for a grant? Is it possible to start this in early December and get it in by the February or mid-December when I don't know anybody or anything at the university or the community? Well, we did it, and it was partly because the people in the Early Learning Public Library Partnership wanted it to happen, and so they all got their troops out and got 17 letters of support and whatever else that we needed to get this in. So what we applied for was an IMLS, Institute for Museum and Library Services, planning grant. And these are only 1 year, and they're exactly what they say. They're for planning. And so at that point, we put forth that we were planning what we were planning for, because you commit to apply for another grant, which we'll be doing this February. So we put in funding to have 2 planning meetings, a little one and a big one. And we said we'd write a white paper on early learning, which would give a thorough research review. It would also tell what was happening nationally in the early literacy scene and in the state of Washington. And we felt at that time we would go for a demonstration grant, which would demonstrate that the state of Washington is a leader in early literacy and with libraries and their partners, but that could be replicated, and somehow we'd figure out how that was going to happen in the grant. That's what we said we would go for. But over the course of the year, and then in September of this year, because we got the grant last September, and we had our small meeting right away last fall, and then we decided to wait till towards the end of the grant to have the big meeting, which is 40 people. We knew that we wanted to capitalize on the partnerships aspects of early learning community in Washington because it is so strong, and we wanted to make it stronger. We wanted to position libraries even more centrally into those partnerships. So we very strategically invited people to this planning meeting, representatives from the Department of Early Learning, from the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, from state legislators' offices, so on and so forth. So mostly librarians from the Early Learning Public Library Partnership, which represents probably about 2/3 of the population of Washington and about half of the library systems, a little bit less than half of the library systems, because it's completely voluntary, of course, whether to be in. And prior to the meeting, we wrote what we could of the white paper. We wrote 5 of 6 chapters, because the 6th chapter is what are our solutions to what we found out when we've done all the literature reviews and the interviews and the meeting and so on and so forth. So in September of this year, we had this meeting, and luckily we managed to get Jean Anderson as our facilitator, and she actually had served as the original director of the Foundation for Early Learning, so she's very conversant with the early learning community and also had worked with libraries. So this is what came out of that meeting, and we tried to we used the white paper as a basis, and we had developed sort of what we thought a model of early learning might look like, we being the researchers at FSU and I, because FSU, the Department of FSU, the Foundation for Early Learning, and the Early Learning Partnership, and the University of Washington are the official partners on this grant. So we tried to work out, Jean Anderson was really good facilitator, and she helped work out a plan where we would try to brainstorm. We had a 2-day meeting, a day and a half meeting, so we tried to brainstorm initially and then narrow down and have people use the dot method of showing what they thought was most important. So at the end, these are the 2 things that came out. The thing I had heard a year and a half before, or a year and a half before, when I first heard about the early learning. The libraries and their partners are still interested in assessment, evaluation, and measurement. They still put top priority on trying to figure out ways to answer the question, does it make a difference for kids to do early learning, early literacy activities in libraries? And that's what came out as their top priority for this grant. The second one was developing even more strategic partnerships and leveraging them. Being sure that libraries are perceived as leaders, as they have been actually demonstrating in practice. Also, these are some of the results that we got when we did our white paper. And the white paper isn't going to be finished until we get our grant done, because the last chapter is what are the solutions, and we haven't written the grant yet. But it will be posted publicly and advertised on all listservs and so forth, probably any that you might be on when we get it done. But the people from the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction liked it so much that they've already distributed in Washington in OSPI, because it has a chapter on a summary of the early literacy research. It has a chapter on what's been done nationally, and it has a chapter on what's been done in Washington. And for somebody who's not, it's a white paper, so it's not a book, it's not an encyclopedia. For somebody who's very conversant with the situation, it might not be hugely informative, but for someone like the people in OSPI who suddenly are being asked by the federal government to develop a literacy plan that goes birth to 12, it lays out exactly where Washington is and where the national scene is in terms of libraries. And so it provides that kind of information for them. What we found out when we did the research for the white paper is that Washington is indeed in the forefront. There are a number of places around the country where there are absolutely fantastic early learning and early literacy things going on. But we didn't uncover a state where it's as coordinated and as rich in including public libraries in the activities that are occurring. We also found, we hunted really hard, that people in Washington are right. There's almost no research measuring outcomes or impacts for children in public libraries, period. We asked everybody we could find. We interviewed people. We did all the literature search. If you know that I'm wrong, please tell me, because we really want to be comprehensive in this white paper. We also found that the National Reading Panel's report in 2000 and the National Early Literacy Panel's report in 2009 really have laid the foundation nationally and locally in Washington for what public libraries are doing in early literacy. We also found that state standards and benchmarks lay the groundwork for early literacy and for other areas. And we also found out what I've just mentioned to you, that our state and all other 49 states are mandated by, I think it's again February 1st of this year, to come up with a state literacy plan that goes from birth to 12. So finally, the Department of Education, who's mandating this, has realized that you need to have that coordination, that it doesn't all start at K and go up. It emerges all through those years. So those are just some of the results from the white paper. So this is what's happened since in the last year or so. And as we look forward to this grant that we're about to write. The State Library of Washington, who also was represented at our planning meeting, is very interested in this, and they've said if we get the grant, they will fund training for us, for librarians. We can't use that as matching, unfortunately. For those of you who know about matching and IMLS grants, you have to have a lot of it. And because they're actually funded through IMLS money that comes to the states through the Library Services and Technology Act, you know, it's the same pot, so we can't count it as matching. But I would say it could be counted as an endorsement. Then the Pierce County Library System, where Mayor Perrick and Judy Nelson are, whom I mentioned, and is really at the forefront of a lot of this, went ahead and applied for a grant from the Boeing Corporation, and I'm serving as the evaluator on that grant, and there is an experimental study that I'm going to tell you about underway with that. Then I came in contact through the Foundation of Early Learning, which is the real linchpin in Washington, and you know, it's part of our grant, so they helped us get connected. I got connected with an educational psychology doctoral student who has developed and tested something called, and she pronounces it BCAP, so the F, I think, kind of disappears, which is the valid and reliable early learning measure in informal environments, and I'm going to tell you about that too. Then the FSU doctoral student that you saw the picture of, who's about to graduate, has constructed something called LCAPstone, which is a valid core knowledge instrument. Measures what do the providers of early literacy really know. So I'll talk more about that. And I already said that. And then I've been nominated to be on this Birth to 12 State Literacy Council. It's a nomination process, and they have a selection committee. So I don't know if I'll be on it, but I was actually nominated by I was asked to be nominated by OSPI. So these are the three things I'm going to talk to you for the rest of the time. The three of the things that I just mentioned to you, because they are very promising, I think, in terms of the research and what we're going to be applying for in this upcoming grant and what we already actually know and have done. So we get back to the question, or do they work successfully? And rather than going for a demonstration grant, we're going to go for a research grant, because that's what the people of Washington, that's what the libraries of Washington and their partners are saying they want. They want us to focus our time and money on finding out if there is a way to demonstrate the answer to this question. Even if it's the wrong answer, it would be an answer. So I want to tell you a little bit about LCAPstone. It is Janet's dissertation project, and Washington played a part in it since she was part of this grant, the planning grant that we had. And so she worked with the Florida Reading Research Center people, and specifically Chris Flanagan, who's on her committee, to develop this instrument based on last year's report from the National Early Literacy Panel of what does research show that's most important to know about early literacy. And so she's developed this instrument, and she did it in exactly the most stringent way to be sure it's valid. It will be valid and reliable. And so she developed 60 questions based on the research, and she came to Washington, and I secured 10 people for her who agreed to take the test, to take the the first version of it, and then talk to her about it. So this was like a pre-test. It was like they could tell her anything they didn't understand, anything that they, if they had expertise, thought wasn't important or was important, or the vocabulary needed to be altered or anything like that. And she talked from people like Judy Nelson, who's really, she was one of the trainers for the ALA initial program, Every Child Ready to Read, and she's very into early literacy, to building level people who are just working with kids. So she talked to all levels of people. Then she went back and she posted her 60, well, she worked with Chris Lonigan, and then she took out a few questions, and then she posted the rest of them on listservs all over the country. And she needed to get 1,000 people, because her theory was item response theory, and she needed that many people to respond to the test so she could see what did everybody know, what did nobody know, and what fell in the middle. And it didn't need to be experts in early learning. She needed some experts, but it could just be anybody. So she did that and got those results back. And what this theory tells you to do is take the middle range. Take out the things nobody knows and take out the things everybody knows. And your test is going to be the middle range. Now, what will we do with this? So in this next year, I think that's why I had the State Library twice. The State Library is actually funding the FSU folks and me for the interim year, because we won't hear from this IMLS grant till next September, if we get it even, to start work on these assessment instruments. And so Janet is now going to test it in the state of Washington with a random sample of 300 librarians. And that'll be part of establishing its reliability. And then, if we get the bigger grant, it will be part of our scheme for, because we feel like, yes, librarians in Washington have been trained. Do they really know early literacy principles, though? So we don't really care on any of these things so much about a specific individual child or adult, but what's the picture look like and where's training need to be done? So if you have this instrument and it shows there's some couple of the early literacy principles that people just don't seem that conversant with, and others that they're really quite conversant with, training can be developed from that. So then I wanted to talk to you about those two assessments that we've started using in Washington as a very early seeing if they work. And the first one is very focused. It's focused on the 6 early literacy principles that the American Library Association pulled out of the National Reading Panel study, and which are very similar across education and LIS in terms of what do you focus on in terms of early literacy, because this is what the research has shown is most predictive of reading success. Now, the vocabulary isn't exactly the same, so the assessment I'm going to show you uses, these are the words that the American Library Association uses. In parentheses are the translations in this assessment I'm going to show you, but they really are the same principles. Instead of narrative, so they use phonological awareness. They don't use narrative skills, but when you hear what they're measuring, it's comprehension. They use print concepts instead of print awareness, and alphabetic principle instead of letter knowledge, but they're the same things. So actually, Eric, if you want to hand out a small handout of this so you can see it. And I only have 11, so if you just look on with somebody, because I'm just going to explain to you how this works. This is, to the best of my knowledge, maybe one of two or maybe the only specific early literacy skill assessment that has been worked out that uses a library material. So it's very appropriate in terms of you're going to do anything with librarians. Doing it with a picture book makes some sense. So the name of this assessment is ELSA, Early Literacy Skills Assessment. It's developed by the HighScope Corporation. I'm sure any of you who've dealt with early learning have heard of HighScope because they do a lot of educational materials. It is construct and concept validated, and it's been also tested for reliability. So it is a real assessment that assesses what it says it does, and it has these 4 things that I've listed there. And the way it works is those 4 questions that relate to those 4 concepts are embedded in this picture book. And this is picture book, Violet's Adventure, and there's also another one that is called Dante's something. So there are 2 choices, but we did Violet. And so this was done first in Carroll County, Maryland. And the Carroll County folks finished their study, and I'm going to explain to you how. And then the people in Pierce County out in Washington decided they wanted to replicate it. So as best as we can, we're replicating the Carroll County study. Now there are some differences, and I'll tell you what some of those are. So Carroll County's results were that they had a control group and an experimental group. They used in-home daycare workers, and they randomly assigned the daycare workers to the study because the children are in homes. You can't randomly assign the children. So they randomly assigned the daycare workers. They had about 50 workers, 50 homes, and they provided a training. Now, a difference in Maryland is they have a state training, and we didn't have a state training in Washington, so we used kind of an adaptation of the ALA training. Train these in-home daycare workers, and then they go away and they get a kit of artifacts. The artifacts aren't really anything particularly special about early learning. They're like little microphones and crayons and things, but everybody has the same tub of things, and that was part of what the Boeing grant was for. I paid $250 for that kit. And then every week, the early learning coordinator at the Pierce County Library sends out an electronic newsletter, or maybe it's every other week, but it's really often, with activities tied to a principal every time, to one of these principles, and also linked to some of the kit materials so that the daycare worker doesn't have to say, I can't do that, I can't afford to buy the whatever, you know. So they also had a midterm interview, phone interview, to see how they're doing. They're urged to come to the library throughout the project. The library will collect collections for any daycare workers and provide them to the daycare workers, so they were encouraged to do that. They came for a second training, and so did they, and this is exactly what happened in both places in Carroll County. And right now, starting just right now, the children are going to be assessed at the end of the study. So I'm going to show you how that assessment is. But in Carroll County, on 3 of the 4 principles, the children came out the children in the experimental study came out statistically ahead of the children in the control group. And then to make it fair, the control group people in both geographical locations get the training the second year. But They don't get any training the first year. Alphabetic principle is the only one there was no change, which kind of makes a little sense because if anybody's going to do anything with daycare kids, they're probably going to teach them the alphabet, right, and teach them to recognize letters. And so it wasn't they didn't learn anything, but they learned at the same rate, whether they were in the intervention or the control group. So if you look at the piece of paper, I'm just going to show you how this goes. You have a page from the book, Violet's Adventure. So you just sit down like this child and adults are doing here, and you read in a comfortable way with the child. Let the child look at the book, but you start out with it upside down and say, how should I put this book if I want to read it? So that's a print concept. That's print awareness. So if they turn it over like this, they get a point. If they don't, they don't. So if you look on the scoring sheet, you'll see that the second page that you have, that every question is has a little place there where you can score it. And you have different numbers that you put in there. So this is the only thing, as one of the things that requires training, is because you have to be able to read the book and quickly jot the score down without it disrupting the children. But believe me, it's possible. And High Scope has a really nice training video which helps you get your assessors become reliable because it shows 3 different adults doing this with a child. And while you watch it, because a doctoral student at Washington and I did the training of the assessors, then while they're watching, they put what they think the score of the child is, and then at the end you compare the people watching the video with the people on the video. And that turned up about 3 problem places where they weren't exactly understanding what they were to listen for or what they were to do. So if you look at the page, back at the page of the book, then you'll see what these embedded things are like. So the page you have, it talks about Violet, and actually, when you finish reading the page, then you look down at the bottom, and you say, Violet saw a tree. What rhymes with tree? Flower, bee, rabbit, or cup. Tree rhymes with, and they either get it right or wrong. So there are actually 3 on that page and 3 on the facing page, or 2 on the facing page. So for item 7 on your score sheet, if a child got it all right, they would get 5 points. 4 if they got 4 right, 3, 2, 1, or 0. And that's their score for that item. And so that's the way the book goes, and each item is keyed to a subset of each of one of these 4 areas that you have on the screen. For example, For example, under phonological awareness, there are items keyed to rhyming, to segmentation, which is clapping out the syllabus, and to phonemic awareness, which is knowing what an individual sound is. Violet starts with V. What does X start with, or something like that? So each one of them has questions that are keyed, and then on the last page that I gave you, you go through and it tells you where to put the score for which questions. That's how you finally get a score for each of the concepts. And they have a scoring guide and tell you exactly how to score it. So each child ends up with that. Now, in an informal learning situation, in the daycare situations, we're not going to be really looking for how much did an individual child improve, but for a composite score. And there is another sheet that's called class score, and you put a child's name and then their score for each of those 4 concepts, and you get a total overall score. And so we'll have an overall score for the control group and for the experimental group. So that is one of the assessment concepts that we are looking at to build on, to think about how could this work in a library? How could you do it with you know, and one of the things we're going to try to demonstrate with our grant is that you don't have to do this and do this and do this. If you can establish that your program is making a difference or where the differences are, you can move ahead. So then the other one I wanted to talk to you about is the one that the College of Education student developed, and it is in PDF form online, and you can go there and look at it. And she did it in the Seattle Children's Museum when she was the early learning director there last summer, and they have classes, formal classes, 5 days of the week. And basically what it is an ethnographic method. This is how the data is recorded and coded. And there are a lot of checklists in the LIS world where you try to observe something and check off. And in my experience with those, you can never think fast enough because kids are doing things and you're trying to check them off, and it gets so, in a group of kids, it gets so confusing, you just lose track. So they just use like a more ethnographic method where they just write what they see. And the people that did the recording were fieldwork students at the UW, but again, this is something that we're presuming volunteers could be trained to do. You write exactly what you see, and then you go away and you write what you think that meant, and then you go to the state standards and benchmarks for early learning and see which ones were observed. So you can get a group score, you can get a score across time, you can get some idea of what children are doing as a group. Again, you'll get an individual score, but not necessarily. So then she replicated it in 2 libraries because the Early Learning Foundation for Early Learning person put it in touch with the libraries. And these were the results from just 2 libraries that she did this summer. But there are 2 kinds of things that happen. One is you ask the librarian or the teacher or the museum leader to predict which observations they think are going to be made, and then you compare that to what was really observed. And so you can see over here, these are educator predictions. That was the librarian's prediction, and these were the things that were observed, and they're broken down by the 5 categories of early learning. So they both represent 100% of what was observed, but the things the children did fell into different categories from what the librarians thought they were. So that's why the orange, they thought they'd be all in literacy, but they weren't. They were in a lot of different categories, which again shows something about the whole child and not just too tightly focusing on literacy. And then, so that's just one of the outcomes of that particular thing. There are other measures we haven't tried, like this is Get It, Got It, Go. It's not as library-ish because it's flashcards, but it's something that could be used. Correlations from national data. IMLS has a lot of data on public libraries, and one of them is what families have library cards. So there's some kind of correlation research that could be done. DIBELS is a test for kindergarten and early learning, early literacy that's used widely around the states. Right now there is something going on in Washington called WAKIDS, which is looking at 3 other kinds of assessments. One of the major questions we're trying to ask is, can the public library and the school system work together so that weaknesses that show up in the incoming kids in an area, public library area, be translated back into programming in the public library. Why do we want to know all this? Well, we want to use informal learning resources in the best way possible to help children succeed in reading and writing and in finding pleasure in doing so. And the bottom line of knowing what children are learning is to shape the program to best meet their needs. So it's not like in school that they get a report card and they go home and they did good or they didn't do well, but so that librarians can focus their efforts where they need to make a difference and where they are making a difference. So that's the end. I don't know whether we have any time.
We've got time for a couple questions. So if there are any people who would wish to pose a question to Eliza regarding her work projects. Okay.
I just had a quick question. What you got here is sort of like a pedagogical book that is used. Has there been any thought to using a real book of children's literature?
Well, to know that you have valid and reliable scores, you have to do a lot of testing with the book you use. I mean, you could use a different book, and I think HighScope just wrote this so they could embed all the things they wanted to, because any book you pick off the shelf, you might not have everything, because they were looking for like the 4 main concepts and then probably 4 sub-concepts under every main concept, and that had to be in the 32-page book. So I think that's why they wrote it themselves.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But might there be a difference in the results based on whether or not the child is actually interested in the story? And pleasure.
Right. Well, these are 3- and 4-year-olds, and I'll have to tell you what we found out is it makes a lot of difference if the assessor shows interest. Because the first person that went back came and said the kids don't like the story. I said, did you tell them you don't like the story? Yeah, I told them I didn't like it either. We said no. I said, you have to be enthusiastic about the story. And they urge you to try to get kids to finish unless they just can't. After that, and this person went out before the training, which was one of the problems. After the training, when we made this point, we assessed 90-some children, and none of those children, except one child who had special needs, asked not to finish or got up and ran away or something. But obviously, yeah, I mean, if it was something they're more familiar with, like the 3 Little Pigs, or something, it could definitely make a difference. But in order to make it an assessment, it almost has to be something that's created. At least this is disguised as a book. I mean, these flashcards and things are just out of context totally. So, yeah. But that's a good question. Yes, it could make a difference. So many things can make a difference in research that if you could just never do any if you had to get everything perfect. And another question? There's one over here.
I wonder if there's any gender differences so far in what you've seen.
We haven't analyzed our data. We're not actually collecting it. It's these people, and that's another difference in Maryland. They had a much larger grant than Pierce County has, so they paid one person did all the pre and post assessments for 200 of them. There are 6 people in this place who are all library employees doing the assessments, and so we are having them record gender, and if they can tell race, we aren't asking race, but if they think they know. So when we analyze the data at the end, we'll look at that, but we haven't predicted anything on it. I think the other one is a dragon or something. I have a suspicion this is a more girly story, and the other one's a little bit more of a boy story. We could have picked either one. I don't know. The library picked it. I don't know why. And it would be interesting to see, does that cause a difference? Because they tell you to stick with the same story. If you can use either one, but if you start with one, to stick with it. So even, so I would say, it isn't the most thrilling story in the world. But and I have it up here if anybody wants to come up and look at it afterwards.
I'm kind of surprised that the librarians weren't going to know outcomes over time. Like we've all been doing preschool story time since the 30s. Is that really having an impact? Or now, since the ALA initiative, we've all been doing the average programs, every child over 3.
Right.
How has that made a difference? This seems to measure where children are at the moment, but it doesn't seem to measure positive or negative outcomes over time.
Yeah, and that, there's no way to go back.
But I'm supposed to ask for a platform now that they could measure
again
a year, 2, 3 years from
Well, actually, the people out in Maryland are following their cohort of kids to 3rd grade. They're following them through. And I think an idea might be, you know, doing something like that if you could get in connection. And there were people there, you know, like I said, from the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. So we're hoping maybe there can be some longitudinal look at effect. But it would have to start now. Yeah, you're right. You can't go backwards. Yeah.
I just wondered if it's difficult to control for other sources of early literacy development. So, outside of the library or the programs like the parents' involvement
Yeah, the best we could do is randomize the daycare workers, hoping that if some of them did one thing, they'd end up, you know, if there were certain things that workers themselves did, that would get sort of randomized, or the parents or families. Absolutely, that could definitely make a difference. The only thing that we do know is that the homes are spread throughout Pierce County, which is pretty big. So they come from different economic levels, and it may kind of even out, but that's a good question, and there's no way to totally know. The one thing that, you know, again, in working with librarians who aren't researchers, there are a lot of things that researchers sort of take for granted that you don't, which is one thing is you yourself don't do a second kind of intervention when you're trying to test this one intervention. And so the early learning coordinator, when we were at the training, some woman said, well, I'm not busy this summer. Could somebody from the library come and tell stories at my daycare? And the early learning person said, oh, yeah, I'd love to do that. We'll come out and, you know, tell stories. So we had to say, no, you can't go out and tell stories at some of them unless you were going to go and tell stories at all of them. So that and another problem with our study is it started in May and it's going till December, and it went the school year in Maryland, and I think, you know, I worried about kids going on vacation and things like that. We did exclude anybody who was entering kindergarten, so they wouldn't go to kindergarten and then come to daycare, because that would have been a huge impact. So we know that these kids are full-time in their in-home daycare, but what happens outside of that, we have any control of.
I was wondering if you were looking into connections with the public health world in Washington and at UW, given that literacy.
Oh, yeah, right. I forgot to mention them. Well, we had representatives from Reach Out and Read and the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at our workshop. And I also forgot to say that we're probably going to focus on 3 to 5-year-olds, because under that, even these observational measures are really hard to make. But those people over at the Learning and Brain Sciences Institute at Washington now have the only MRI machine in the world that scans infants. And they are doing research on actually some of the questions that have to do with early literacy through actually observation of the brains. We had the Reach Out and Read people who do the giveaways to books in pediatricians' offices. And they wrote a letter of support for our grant before, and they're very interested. We haven't exactly figured out how we might work best with them, but they're definitely in our partnership radar, and they're supportive of it.
We've got to end our session right now because it is a couple minutes after 1 o'clock, but I want to please ask you to give a concluding round of applause for our speakers.